Live from the SABC's Auckland Park studios, welcome to this week's first episode of The Watchdog. My name is Vuyo Mvogo, and here's what we have in store for you this evening.
He believes that there's a breakdown of relationship between me and him, and it's irreconcilable.
Drama as Action SA Gauteng leader quits the party. What exactly happened? Bongani Baloyi is one of my guests. Beyond stage 8 load shedding, what would things look like? An expert tells you all you need to know. University South Africa weighs in on the issues behind ongoing protests at various tertiary institutions. All that and more in tonight's episode of The Watchdog, which starts right now. The higher education sector in the country is again dealing with multiple protests on many of our country's campuses, largely related to funding and accommodation. Dr. Petiwe Matutu is the CEO of University South Africa, the umbrella body to which all 26 public universities are affiliated. Good evening, Dr. Matutu. Thanks very much for your time.
Good evening, Vuyo, and good evening to the viewers of SABC.
So it's something we have come to expect. At the beginning of each year, we're going to see these protests.
Absolutely. The issue of unaffordability of higher education is becoming a problem. And I do think that we need to pay attention as a country, because it can't be that each time at the beginning of the year, we put our students, staff members within the universities, and the management of the university in danger because of this unaffordability of higher education to certain sectors of society.
Is that what it boils down to? Unaffordability, nothing else?
That is at the core of the protests that we are seeing, because we are talking here about a certain class, socio-economic class, which it doesn't have access to higher education. Mm-hmm. So the lower middle class has been complaining for quite some time about inability to access higher education. So the so-called missing middle, that's the lower middle class, and they are unable to access higher education. And then secondly, now in the middle of all of that, we get the capping of accommodation by NSFAS. And what that translates to is the partial funding of higher education for students who are in the low socio-economic class. So that is also another issue of unaffordability, because basically what NSFAS is saying is that we can't afford to pay anything for students who are within the low socio-economic class. Whereas they had committed, at least government had committed to fully funding these students previously.
Now, what has been the thinking then, Dr. Matutu, because we've kind of come to, we know what to expect now at the beginning of each year. And we know from what you've just told us, what is at the core of this? What is really the biggest contributor to this chaos we see at the beginning of each year? What then has been the thinking, about how to address, how to avoid being in the same situation come next year?
The reality is that the solution to this issue does not rely on the higher education sector. It relies heavily on the government leadership and South Africa as a whole in terms of how to address this issue, because the universities are the public good, basically. So the entire country has to come in, led by the Department of Higher Education and Training. And of course, the Department of Higher Education and Training is doing some of the interventions to try and deal with this. By the end of the month, they had promised that they will come up with clear recommendations from Parliament to the general public on how to deal at least with the missing middle.
Well, it looks like it's going
and we are awaiting that.
It looks like it's going to be a while before, we actually get there. One can, I think, predict that come this time next year, we'll be in this very same situation we are in now, given just how the mills, tend to grind in Parliament, especially when piloting legislation and all of that. They tend to grind very, very slowly. The question then becomes, is the sector ready, or are there ideas out there as to how to avoid what we've seen over the past couple of weeks?
The sector has been mobilized by the minister who set a ministerial task team in order to look into this problem holistically. It was led by a vice-chancellor with a deputy being a vice-chancellor as well, that task team, ministerial task team, and putting forward some of the proposals that University of South Africa, for instance, had put forward in other commissions which had looked into this in 2016. So insofar as that, the sector has been mobilized. In addition to that, University of South Africa has also raised some funds, largely from the SETA. The SETAs who have been directed by the Minister of Higher Education and Training to support higher education, particularly the missing middle and the issue of student debt. So over the past 3 years, we've been able to mobilize resources to the tune of about R1 billion in order to assist in this particular cause. The private sector has been there, for instance, the banks as well, but the major funder has been the SETAs, being mobilized by the Minister of Higher Education and Training, Mr. Nzimande.
Now, last week we were told that there's all these conversations taking place between universities, the Ministry and Department of Higher Education, NSFAS, and so on. Has any progress been, or is any progress being made on that score?
That team is being led by the Department of Higher Education and Training. And so far, I'm not aware of any significant progress which has been made in that front. So we'll hear from the department as soon as there is something significant to report in that front.
Mm-hmm. Have there been any engagements between universities and NSFAS on the CAP issue?
The engagement has been mediated by the minister. We met with the minister about a week ago on the 3rd of this month to highlight the challenges which universities are facing pertaining to the issue of capping. And the minister was quite responsive to our concerns and set up this team where the department was there, NSFAS was there, and universities were there. So that is supposed to be convened by the Department of Higher Education and Training. So the starting point was to look at the appeals and the nature of the appeals and the quantity of the funds which is being requested by the universities between the cap and the amount that they actually need to get NSFAS students into residences.
Would you say there's hope?
There is hope, because I got a sense that the minister takes this, it doesn't take this lightly, is aware of the urgency with which it has to be dealt. And everyone is seeing that we've had at least 10 universities which have had student protests. And I wouldn't say that that's a normal occurrence. We are seeing that out of the levels of frustrations of students, violence is another area that we need to take into account in our campuses. And the fact that universities now are starting to call in the police and the private security talks to the levels of intimidation and the levels of violence which are being experienced within the universities. And at the core of that are the frustrations due to the inability to access higher education by certain sectors within the student body. So it's something that needs to be taken very, very seriously. This is an issue of, it's a human rights issue. It's a social justice issue. We can't treat it as something that needs to be ignored. We need to be quite responsive. And we are aware of that. The universities where it's happening, there's very little they can do. Insofar as if they start to look at this thing and think that they are going to fund higher education, evidently we're going to end up with unsustainable universities. And the worst thing to happen would be a situation where we cripple the higher education sector in such a way that if you want to get a South African student to study, you have to take that student elsewhere abroad. So it's very important that we end up with sustainable higher education institutions. And there's no way in which they can write off debts and still continue to function appropriately.
Well, let's hope the situation doesn't get worse. And there's, our leaders, both at tertiary institutions, but also in politics and everywhere else, show leadership and a bit of vision as well. Tudu, thanks very much for your time.
Thank you very much for you.
She's the CEO of Universities South Africa. After the break, thinking beyond stage 8 load shedding, what you need to know. Now, some have called it alarmist, but the reality is that South Africa's load shedding crisis could get worse before it gets better. Refusing to talk about it or burying our heads in the sand, not going to stop the nightmare from happening. So what is the thinking then from all those who are in the know, who can do something about it? What are they discussing? What are they doing to prevent a situation worse than we have been through? Well, Vali Padayachi is an engineering professional with 40 years continuous experience in the power and energy sectors. He's currently the chairman of an organization called the National Rationalized Specifications Association, Association of South Africa, or in short, the NRS. Recently, the NRS uncharacteristically went public, deciding to issue a media release to provide South Africans with and I quote, a sense of reasonable comfort that the proactive, detailed planning and risk mitigation for the possible migration to higher load shedding stages beyond stage 8 has actually been thoroughly and proactively thought of, influenced and interrogated in a structured manner, but also with a sense of urgency. Father Parayachi, good evening. Thanks very much for your time.
Good evening, viewer, and a very good evening to your viewers as well. And thank you very much for inviting me on a very, very critical subject, but I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, I mean, some of us didn't even know of an organization called the NRS and what it does. In a nutshell, what exactly do you do and who forms part of this structure?
Very briefly, it's an organization that started, I think, approximately 25 years ago. Started where like-minded bodies, and when I say like-minded, it was all the metros of the country, all the municipalities, Eskom Holdings, NESA, and SABC, in the main, form that body, and that body, the NRS Association, is an unincorporated, non-profit organization, and importantly, independent. And we get our legal mandate. Okay, maybe before we get there, we produce a number of specifications over the years, which eventually become standards, and those standards get its legal mandate either through the SABC process, which becomes SANS, or through the NESA process, and hence the NRS 048 Part 9 is part of that process.
To do what exactly?
We mainly, in the main, provide specifications which become standards in the electricity supply industry. Maybe I'll add the electricity distribution industry. So it's in that arena that we provide or develop some specifications. And these are being used, as I say, the last 20, 25 years with significant success. And one of the most important specifications or standards is the NRS 048 Part 9, which in a nutshell regulates load reduction or load shedding. And we can talk about that a bit more.
Why do you choose to call it load reduction?
Well, load reduction is actually the preferred technical term, and load shedding is that we go wider than the technical people, so that at least Joe public can understand that in very simple language. But as engineers, we prefer load reduction, but of course we're talking to the public, and so load shedding is a term that's used common. Yes.
Well, Joe public is worried right now that our situation could easily get worse. We see no evidence, well, apart from appointments of electricity minister and so on, but we see no evidence that we are moving in a recognizable direction that will, where the worst case scenario of your stage 16s can be avoided. From where you sit, is it avoidable?
Let me give you a professional response, maybe a very pragmatic response and a practical response. So, given the state of the grid at the moment, and the grid I'm talking about holistically, and of course the current crisis is on the generation side. So from a professional point of view, engineering professional point of view, I don't think I can give you a guarantee that we would not go beyond stage 6, let alone beyond stage 8. So as a professional, I think unless some significant interventions take place, I cannot give you a guarantee that we cannot go to advanced levels of load shedding, load reduction beyond stage 8. And it's because of that view, which obviously causes tension, trepidation in all walks of life. And it's for that very reason the NRS Association, and you made mention of it, we came up with our first media release in 25 years of our existence. And I won't get to why we did that, because
But I want to know, and that's precisely why I put that in my intro, to say this is extraordinary, because we never hear from, people
Yes.
like your organization. So why did you feel there was a need for something like that?
Yeah, as I indicated, because I'm unable to give you that guarantee, it means that we could go beyond stage 8, right? Whether we get to stage 10, 12, 16, that's a debatable point, okay? I think, personally, we wouldn't get to stage 16 because that's reported in the media. But let me give you the rationale as to why, in our statement, we alluded to that. And I think at this stage, I must get to the standard, the NRS 048, Part 9. Now that standard, it is a standard because it is a mandated document by NESA Edition 2, right? So very quickly, Edition 1 went up to stage 4, right? And up to stage 4, if you are load shedding, beyond stage 4, it's easy, and I put that in inverted commas, for national control and system operator to load shed beyond that in an emergency contingency environment. Right. Then when you get to edition 2, we went up to stage 8, right? And if you get beyond stage 8 to load shed, because with stage 8, half your grid is not performing, it's not available megawatts, and if you need to load shed in an emergency situation after stage 8, and with the current standard, we would go into an emergency situation, contingency measure, which is prone to an error. Now, I say that very advisedly, right? What we've done with edition 3, which is still draft at the moment, and once it gets to the NESA process, once our management committee has approved it, gets to the NESA process, and if they approve, it becomes mandated. What we've done here is that we've totally mitigated going into an emergency situation and contingency measure. So what we've done is we've formalized the load shedding, and whether it goes 10, 12, 16, to take the full load into consideration. That's as much as simple as I can make it to. So by doing that, it takes away the propensity of national control, system operator, and more importantly, the other utilities, the other 177 licensees, from making an error, potential error, if we need to go beyond stage 8, stage 9, stage 10, because then the proverbial it's the fan. So the edition 3, in very simple terms, allows those utilities, and it's a utility document, in a very structured manner to load shed up to beyond stage 8. So that's the essence of that document, and that's the comfort we want to give the public, that if we get in there, which we can't guarantee we will not get in there, right? There is a structured way, a methodology, and an approach. Because I'm a national control system operator who are doing a fantastic job at the moment. South Africa is the only country where we haven't gone into a blackout situation. Load shedding is an excellent management tool, but they're all humans, right? So what we've done as a responsible body, as the NRS Association, we've assisted the utilities to virtually negate that error from ever happening, right? So, but one more point, Rio. The NRS 048 Part 9 standard does not subrogate, that's the legal term, whatever national control or the system operator does. So when the proverbial really hits a fan and there's a need for national control and system operator to take actions, which they're doing, then they don't need to wait for this document or use the document. But they will be empowered and armed with that, especially the utilities. So what we're saying in a nutshell, we don't need another 048 Part 9 Edition 3 to be finalized to make the grid safe. Because the utilities, meaning ESCOM and the municipalities, are fully empowered because we've gone to significant consultation from Edition 1. So that is why I am comfortable in saying this, that in the, let's say, the unlikely event that we go beyond stage 8 to advanced levels, then we take comfort that the utilities, the national control and the control rooms are more than reasonably empowered not to take us into a blackout situation. And I think this document, and we are fast-tracking it to get it approved, right, between the NRS and, of course, NESA. I mean, that's their processes, but NESA is part of our team. That's the assurance we want to give the public, that they can rest well that if we get into that situation, and I'm repeating here, it'll be done in a structured manner, in a well thought of manner, in a manner that we're simply, we don't have to embark on emergency contingency measures. We will do it in a structured, formalized manner.
One thing, was one of the stories I had at the weekend was how, if you're taking a mining operation, for example, you have people who are underground, and you can't just switch those people off, because it means they may not breathe them and they may die there. That's, you know, very real. Now, when you get to those higher stages, you know, what happens in such situations where, for example, you know, how someone was saying mines could shut down easily.
Yeah, I think that's obviously not a desirable condition in any event. Not to go into too much of detail, firstly, and I'm glad you mentioned the mine will be classified as a critical load. So critical load will be exempted from load shedding, right? But before we get to load shedding or load reduction, VUO, there are a number of other steps that national control takes before an emergency is declared. Actually, when you load shed, an emergency is declared. That's how you load shed. And before you get there, the mines, refineries, other similar entities would curtail. So they would reduce their, let's call it load and demand. So they would be forewarned by national control to expect load shedding, and hence this aspect about, as you say, God forbid, that the compressors, all that, stop working. So they would have backup for that, but I think there's enough, let's call it contingency measures, before we get to load shedding, for loads of that nature to be adequately forewarned.
Because, I mean, you would have seen over the past week, I think, a couple of the network operators were talking about how their profits are going to be affected. But at a very real practical level, it also means that you and I can communicate. as well, if we're going to go for, 24 hours without, electricity, something's going to happen.
Let me be honest about this, and let's not beat about the bush. God forbid if we get into a blackout situation. Blackout, now, a load shedding, load reduction is a controlled process where we take off load in smaller areas throughout the country. We do that in a very controlled manner. And I said to you, National Control is doing a good job. If we free fall, then when you get into a blackout situation, there's no control or minimal control, right? So it's either the major part of the country or the whole country gets knocked off completely. That is why we don't want to get there. If you get into that situation, it's debatable whether it takes 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, depending on the industry. Whether you're a refinery, mine, telcos probably will take 3-4 weeks, maybe longer. And this is where what we call a black start needs to start, where you need to start from afresh, right? That is why VIO, and I'm not making load shedding to be the panacea, but what we're saying is that load shedding, and I keep on saying this in the media, from a technical engineering point of view, is an excellent management tool because we're in control, albeit it causes a lot of inconveniences and messes up the economy and all of that. But it does not take us into a blackout situation. If we get into a blackout situation, comparatively, it's like if, I would say in my opinion, if load shedding is impacting you at 1 to 10, a scale of 7, where 7 is so good, blackout would be 1 or 2, because then national control system operator would what we call pull the breakers and just load shed. Because end of the day, what do? We've got to maintain the supply and demand, right? And maybe just to add a point there, the National Disaster Act declared, and it was declared in response to the impact of load shedding, right? So the various ministers that issued the various regulations, right? That has created a bit of complexity into how we implement NRA 048 Part 9 Edition 3 going forward, because the regulations are low, right? For example, and I stand to be correct with the numbers, but for example, the Department of Health is wanting, I think, 217 hospitals to be isolated, and I think there's only 71 done. Now, a quick reaction to that is, if you isolate 217 hospitals, and if they're all embedded in the grid, we may not be able to load shed at all. So you can't have that situation, right? That's only the Department of Health. What about the other sectors? So actually we had a big meeting today, the management committee and the work group, with a number of stakeholders as to how do we harmonize, that's the word, how do we harmonize the National State of Disaster regulations with what we are wanting from NRA 048 Part 9, Edition 3, and National Control, so that we try and satisfy as many of the stakeholders, but being cognizant of the fact that end of the day, we're going to prevent the grid from collapsing. So that's why I say we may not be able to do the 217 hospitals, but then we talk about being technical, giving them special feeders. But what is the impact of that? That there's no such thing as a free lunch. It comes at a cost and so on. So that's why I say it very advisedly that we need to harmonize the regulations with the standard, with what national control wants, to prevent a blackout situation.
But are those conversations taking place where it matters? In other words, the people who have the power to decide, whose fingers are on the trigger, you know, are those conversations taking place there?
I'm glad you asked that question. I can tell you, Vio, that the level of consultations that have taken place thus far over the many months to where we're in edition 3 at the moment is so wide. In fact, we went beyond our mandate as another association. Our mandate says you consult with relevant industry players, right? The real consultation for the Joe public is through the NESA process, right? But we went beyond that. In fact, it was so significant consultation. We established 8 work streams, and we consulted with the EIUGs, the mining houses, the BUSAs of this world, metros, Munichs, almost every stakeholder, the health department. We're still consulting. We've got a big meeting with NEDLAC on Friday. I'm going there, the chairman of the association and the chairman of the work group. And this is our 3rd intervention with NEDLAC. I mean, that's how serious this matter is. So to answer your question, I'm comfortable that we've done significant consultations as a association, as a work group, notwithstanding that NERSA will do their own consultation, but I think we've assisted NERSA in that regime, but NERSA still has that mandate. Because at the end of the day, we want to try and get to an approved document. We want to get to an approved document, mandated document, legal document, so that it becomes a license condition for all utilities. So that we don't have any confusion, we don't have any ifs and buts when a call is made to protect the grid. And we found that by having a legal mandated document, it gives you that opportunity to do so.
To what extent currently, are the utilities, or do the utilities have more leeway? In other words, to what extent do they have discretion, you know, and could easily mess things up? Perhaps not deliberately,
yes,
you know, but yeah.
Well, let me answer that as an engineer. So, as an engineer, you with your best endeavors, you put something out there. I mean, this is a technical document in the main, right? But it's executed by humans, right? And we try and empower and enable the humans as best as we can. But you know, human error, and of course, that's why we need to stop load shedding. Because I can tell you our people are getting tired, right? So the propensity of making an error is always there, but it's to what level? I mean, we can't guarantee 100%, we'd like to, but we can take it as close as possible to 100%. And hence this code of practice and standard will significantly mitigate that propensity to make an error. And bear in mind that the team that works in these control rooms and even national control, they are top-notch. They are more than adequately trained. I call them the pilots of the power system. You know, as the pilot keeps the aircraft afloat, they keep the system afloat. But we've got to help them. And I say, they are humans. And I'm comfortable that as an NRS association, we've done as best as we can to mitigate that risk.
Remind us again, what would happen if you abandon this work you're doing? In other words, what are the consequences for the country?
Okay, so I take it you mean if you abandon, say, edition 3, right? So
Yeah.
we sit with the edition 2, which is a mandated document. The country is still safe, right? Except, as I indicated, the risk of making an error could still be a bit more. Because with edition 2, if you go beyond stage 8, God forbid, then national control system operator and the utilities, Munich and so on, would get into a emergency mode and contingency mode. And as I said, that's where the propensity to make an error could emanate. By edition 3 goes through its process, and we harmonize the disaster regulations, takes away that propensity to make an error. We've mitigated that error, I believe, to its utmost minimal, right? And that's why we are very, very careful as to who do we exempt. In terms of the process, anybody can apply for exemption. You and I can apply for exemption. We go through the process. But we must just be very careful that we've got to be prudent about it. We've got to be quite mature about it. That when we exempt, in fact, edition 3, we are quite strict about who do we exempt. And the more people you exempt,
The more instability you introduce.
exactly, because other people have to take the brunt, because it's supply versus demand, right? It's just simple as that. And the worst case scenario, when you get into an under frequency situation, you don't have minutes, you have seconds to protect the grid. So what we've done here, I'm just repeating again, is to take away those risks as much as we can and enable, especially national control, system operator and utilities, to reasonably protect the grid, even if you go beyond stage 8. So to get back to your, if you abandon this view, and given where the state of the grid is now, I'll be a bit uncomfortable.
What gets considered before an exemption, currently, before an exemption is granted?
Now, firstly, it's protection of the grid, right? In your context. So wherever you're in the country and you apply, so it's 177, say the Munich's licensees and so wherever you are, you apply. I mean, if you're staying in Pretoria, you'll apply to Shwani. If I'm staying in Joburg, City Power, etc. And so there's various criteria. And what we've done is, it's the responsibility, accountability of NERSA, but in terms of standard, we've kind of delegated that to the heads of department of the utilities. And what we're considering now, given the state of the grid and the propensity of high stages, is to also, in conjunction with NERSA, set some rules, right? A framework as to what...
I'll tell you, because treat it like as practical as possible. Nelson Mandela Bay has a water crisis.
Yes.
A big part of the problem, the bureaucrats there say, is not so much that there's no water, but they can't pump them.
Yes.
And now, they are not winning in conversations with ESCOM.
Yes.
You know, about certain exemptions or a bit of flexibility so that they can do what needs to be done before the crisis worsens. On the other hand, you hear arguments from health workers, and they involve human rights issues about the need to protect lives and so on. So hospitals, you've got to exempt. Yeah. So it's the integrity of the grid versus threats to life.
Yes.
You know, hence I'm asking not for Joe Soap. You know, what is this criteria? What gets looked?
Let me answer it this
before
way,
these
Vuyo.
exemptions gets granted.
Let me answer it this way. It may not be the response you're looking for. I can tell you that national control system operator and the utilities, many utilities control rooms, as a general comment, are faced with that almost every minute of the day. Somewhere, somebody wants, let's call it the critical load to be exempted and so on. And of course, we made some accommodations here for that between 5% and 6.25% to give that leeway, a bit more flexibility. But at the end of the day, you've got to be cruel to be kind. In other words, and I've said it in the forums that I've been using my chair of the MANCOM, is that our business is to protect the grid. So we will do, we meaning the collective, national control and so on, whatever is necessary to exercise that mandate. And by having this standard and all of that, we try and make it as comfortable as possible. We don't want to get a situation, the worst case situation, which is diabolical, I call it when even if you're going out to a blackout situation, when you need to call out blackout, let's soft land it. As opposed to getting to a panic situation and you pull breakers and you just shut off large areas, which includes life support systems, all of that. So by going this route in a very methodical, structured manner, we try and soft land. So what I'm saying, even if you need, and I must be careful because the media may misquote me on this, even if we need to load shed and get to stage 16, right? It's a preferred way of doing that so that we soft land getting into a subsequent blackout situation, right? As opposed to not having a structured approach, and then when we get beyond stage 8, and then we start pulling breakers and we shut off bigger areas and cause more disharmony and all of that. I'm not sure if I'm making sense. It's, end of the day, it's a technical requirement. If you don't follow that process, you don't match the supply and demand to the second, you'll collapse the grid. And I think that is why we are doing all this good work. And of course, unlike water, and I'm digressing a bit, electricity, maybe soon, is the only commodity that you cannot store in bulk. So it creates all these complexities that we're talking about.
We were given hope when the president said, "Oh, well, big industrial players, mining companies, and Sasols and the like will be able to generate their own electricity, even then the surplus would go, into the grid." But we hear nothing about progress that is being made there, because one, you're going to take these big industrial players, off the grid eventually, which would help a great deal, but also they're going to generate
No, I would defer there. I think those also that you're mentioning, because it affects the business. I mean, the electricity bill typically is about 30%. It's increasing every year. So those business houses, the mines and the Sasols and all of that, are working flat out trying to mitigate the risk. But the nature of this beast, the nature of this sector is such that it's not an easy process. It's a long-term game. That's why the reality is common knowledge that we're going to solve this problem not tomorrow. In my opinion, it'll be minimal 2 years. It's going to be more than 2 years because we have global macroeconomics, the Ukraine war, the European Union situation, all of that. But what I see going forward, and maybe this is the strategic view, is that, and the Minister of Finance gave an hint in his budget speech, They've allocated money, Treasury, to Eskom. But the money is mainly allocated to transmission and distribution to the grid. And for generation, it's only maintenance. So the message there is, Eskom, you will no longer play a bigger role in generation. So you carry on with your current maintenance and so on. Going forward, it'll be the grid. So what I see, and this is my view, is that between the metros and Munichs and Eskom, who own the national grid collectively, they will provide the infrastructure, the access to the infrastructure for the private sector in a very prudent manner to bring on the electrons. Right? And this is where the likes of Sassels and all of that will do so. They will self-generate, but you're also allowed to generate more and bring them onto the grid. And that's important because I can safely say that metros and Munichs generally don't have the balance sheet and all that. We all like to get into generation, but we just don't have the means. So let the private sector come on board, right? But it must be done on a prudent basis. When I say prudent view, there's a view that you can solve this crisis only with renewables. You cannot do that. South Africa has abundant supply of non-renewables, what we call dispatchable technologies, like clean coal technologies, nuclear, hydro, all that. So we must bring all of that into the mix, right? Let the private sector play into that, and let Eskom keep the existing fleet functioning, because they need to be at 70-75%. Because that's how the electricity plan is predicated on. If you're sitting at 50%, then we need more than 6,000 megawatts. So going forward, I think the metros, Munichs, and Eskom will provide that highway, the infrastructure, to transport the electrons.
Oh. Valuparayachi, thanks very much for your time and insights.
Thank you, View. And I think my just final comment is that we are sitting on a knife edge, but I think we have taken prudent measures to ensure that at least we mitigate the risk of going into a blackout situation. We may go into advanced levels of load shedding. Unfortunately, it will cause some discomfort, but you don't want to be in a blackout situation.
Okay.
So, thank you.
Let's leave it there. Thank you very much for your time. Well, we were going to speak to former Midvaal Mayor and actually SA Gauteng Chairperson. Something happened, so apologies for promising you that, but we were unable to deliver on it because we don't know what actually happened. We were expecting it. That's our show for tonight. Do join us again tomorrow night, same time. Good night.